Well, at least some of us here are old enough to remember that great comedian Jack Benny, whose comic genius was in parading himself as the utmost tightwad. I remember this classic joke that kind of typified his routine. He says, a robber comes up to him and puts a gun at his back. Your money or your life? And then there's this long pause. And the robber says, well? And he says, I'm thinking. Jack Benny did this with his impeccable straight face, which made him all the more laughable. Of course, we know, don't we, that our lives are more important than money? Of course, thanks to Jesus, today we might find ourselves thinking. Jesus isn't standing in back of us with a gun, or even by walking into a Walmart heavily armed and wearing body armor, expecting no response. It's worse than that. He is standing in front of us with his kind eyes and his laughing smile and with his open arms and with his crucified hands and with the utmost seriousness inviting us not to be afraid. In fact, to sell our possessions, to give alms, to store our treasure in heaven. All because of this, he says, it is your Father's pleasure to give you all these things. This past week, Adam and I had the pleasure of giving good things to our daughter Jessie and our son-in-law FJ and our 3 granddaughters, Emma, Jane, and Charlotte. It was our joy to lavish them with attention and love. We delighted ourselves as much as our granddaughters with plenty of playtime, including kicking our feet in the water, learning to fish, holding wiggly worms on our hands, story time, painting time, puzzle time. We even sat next to them making funny faces while they ate their vegetables. Of all of these wonderful activities, the favorite that they picked of the whole time together was me holding my hands like this and then putting on a monster face and running after them and catching them with a big bear hug. I did this over and over and over. I have strong muscles now in my arms. Where does that delight come from, if not from God? It is God's good pleasure to give us good things. Any parent or aunt or uncle, heck, anyone who knows, who's bought a special gift for someone they love, knows this deep down. Yesterday, I sat for a bit with the Oakshott family. Their mother, Pat, is in hospice now, a much-loved mother, grandmother, and she is taking her last breaths, very calm, wonderful breaths. And we prayed together, and then the whole family gathered to tell stories, and they laughed, and they cried. There is nothing, absolutely nothing better than doing kindness for or giving a gift to, or playing with, or taking care, or even just being with someone you love. Nothing. And what is amazing about the gospel today is that Jesus knows this, that is what God is like as well. Not a rule enforcer or a power player or a monarchical ruler, but a loving, generous gift giver. This is what gives God joy. It is God's good pleasure to give us his kingdom. And so many of us here have already tasted that goodness. So this is one reason not to be afraid and to live into an outrageous generosity. The second is this: we are made in God's image. Now, to get ready for the pilgrimage that I will be joining many of the youth of our diocese on, and I'll be leaving this Wednesday, that is, if my luggage comes back from Saturday, but anyway, I'm hopefully going to be leaving regardless. But to prepare for this, I've been reading about many of the Irish saints that we will be visiting the different sites of. And of all of them, my favorite now, I've decided, is the Celtic lay monk who's named Pelagius. Unlike his contemporary, Augustine, who posited that we are all born into depravity, Pelagius asserts that at the very heart of humanity is the image and the likeness of God. And as such, our deepest desires are for God. They're for what is good. It's essential to who we are. It's our DNA, is God. Of course, we do not always live up to the persons that God has called us and created us to be. This week, we grieve over a notorious child molester, evidently committing suicide. I wish he had lived long enough to understand God's love and God's forgiveness. 2 other young men slaughtered innocent people in seconds, one at least for avowed racial motives. His whiteness was threatened, so much so that he would shoot women and children and leave scars on the whole country as we grieve. How the image of one who was created got lost, so lost in him, we don't know. But to people whose lives are rooted in the Bible, in Jesus, the image of their Creator was severely obscured. In contrast was the life of Toni Morrison, a great, influential novelist whose stories dig through the hard crust of racial hatred that continues to cause suffering to all of us. Reading her novels, it's difficult not to feel the compassion of the Creator and for God's suffering children and God's grief at what has so often obscured God's image in us, his children. After a week like this, one when the country is convulsed in the revulsion of those who would maim and destroy, Pelagius acknowledges that there are, of course, other desires in us as well, confused, destructive ones, which can obscure the true self. What makes it difficult for us to do good, he contends, is the long habit of doing wrong which has infected us from childhood and corrupted us little by little over many years, and ever after holds us in bondage and slavery to itself, so that it somehow seems to have acquired the force of nature. He goes on to say that the more wrong is multiplied, the more our essential nature becomes buried and therefore is harder to recover, even to the point where we suppose, as Augustine did, that we have entirely lost it. Evil, he tells us, is like a fog that blinds us to the God within. In his spiritual teachings, Pelagius advises that we should learn to listen within ourselves and then compare what we find in us to who Jesus is and calls us to become. That is why, says Pelagius, when a person gives generously to the poor and the needy and takes in widows and orphans, everyone knows that person's actions are good and holy. You don't have to think about it. People do not argue about whether generosity and forgiveness are good or bad. They know that it's good because it touches that depth of divinity in all of us. Our generous God gives us the kingdom, which is playful and rich and joyful because it's a kingdom of love. We don't earn it. We can only receive it as a gift. In short, when we realize it is God's good pleasure to care for us, to love us, to take care of us, and give us all good things, even his kingdom, then it becomes a lot easier to give rather than to hoard, to live from a sense of courage rather than fear, to operate out of a sense of abundance rather than scarcity. What is your image of God that you bring with you today? Let me end with this playful poem called God Says Yes to Me, and it's by Kaylin Hout. She says, I asked God if it was okay to be melodramatic. She said yes. I asked her if it was okay to be short, and she said, sure is. I asked her if I could wear nail polish or not wear nail polish, and she said, honey, she calls me that sometimes. She said, you can do just exactly what you want to. Thanks, God, I said. And is it even okay if I don't paragraph my letters? Sweet cakes. God said, who knows where she picked that up. What I'm telling you is yes, yes, yes. It is God's pleasure to give us his heart, to make us into his image, to tuck his goodness into us from the moment we were born, to render our hearts as reliable places of hugging. Trust your heart. That's where Jesus can be found. God is the ultimate yes that there is. Amen.